I think the question is, as we sit here with mindfulness on the cover of Time magazine, with Mindful magazine on the newsstands, with headlines every day about how popular it's becoming, and perhaps even if that's a good thing, which we'll get to later, the question I have for you is, are people practicing today? Are people engaging with mindfulness today for the same reasons they were 30 and 40 years ago? And are they still practicing the same thing? Is mindfulness today the same as it was 3 and 4 decades ago?
I think largely people are practicing for the same reasons, that we have personal suffering or we have tremendous curiosity about the nature of life. We want to look deeper. And I think that's basically the same. What is fascinating to me is the question of how intense that motivation needs to be in order to begin a practice. It's like I was 18 years old. I was going to school in Buffalo, New York. I was a junior. And I had to create an independent study project for the university in order to go to India to learn how to meditate, because I just couldn't see it around me. And I wasn't interested in a philosophical exploration or a comparative religion exploration. I wanted to know if there were some practical, pragmatic tools I might undertake that would really change my life. And that kind of meant going to India. I went to India. I had never even been to California when I went to India. Really. I grew up in New York City. I went to school in Buffalo. I had one family trip to Florida, and that was it. And suddenly I was in India. And most of us were like that. I also want to do a deep bow to Dan Goleman, who brought me to my first meditation retreat. I met Dan in December of 1970.
Oh, that's right.
And he told a group of us about this intensive meditation retreat that was about to happen in Bodh Gaya, which sounded like exactly what I was looking for, a very practical immersion in the tools, and it was. And so it's all connected, in some way.
And so when you talk to the many people you interviewed for Real Happiness at Work, were the same motivations, were the same ones that they were expressing, the same things that rang a bell? Are these the same things that inspired you to go to India?
I think they were the same things. They are the same things. I'm still curious, like, what's it like when we just pick up a book off a shelf or hear something on the radio, and we don't have to create an independent study project and go all the way to India? Can we find that wholeheartedness? And we can, of course. Right. But it takes a certain contextualization, I think.
Thank you. Dan, your thoughts on basically the same question. When we spoke recently, you described mindfulness as a way to take back control of something that is being lost in an invisible, insidious way. What did you mean by that? And again, is that the same pull, the same thread that connected you and Sharon in 1970 with the people that are perhaps discovering mindfulness at General Mills today?
Well, Sharon and I maybe have the same view, but I would put it a little differently. And that passage actually refers to something else. In the year 2005, Time magazine wrote an article, said, there's a new word in the English language, pizzled. It's a combination of puzzled and pissed off. And it's how we feel when the person we're with takes out their phone and starts talking to someone else. 10 years ago, we were indignant. Now it's the new normal. So what I saw as insidious was that the norms for attention have changed. And particularly our technological devices are intruding continually on our focus, on our attention, whether it's at work or with other people. You go to a romantic restaurant and couples out to dinner, and they're both looking at the phone, not in each other's eyes. That was the insidious part. And it snuck up on us. But in terms of the question that you asked, I would say that the traditional motivation for mindfulness meditation, or Vipassana, as the course that we went to is called, was not to do better at work and not to be happier and not, in the everyday sense, or more productive. It was to become liberated from the round of suffering in the Buddhist sense. And I think there's a spectrum that runs from I want to be more effective on the one hand to I want to go all the way, and that those are two different strategies and two different ways of practicing, both valid, but different motivation.
Thank you. Janice, mindful leadership, how does that relate to the mindfulness that we just heard described? I know you personally, of course, as I wrote about in the Financial Times, came to mindfulness at large much through these same avenues. You had an incredibly difficult period in your life. You went on retreat with John Kabat-Zinn, and it touched you in a very deep and personal way. And it was only in subsequent years that you really developed this framework of mindful leadership.
So what happened there was what I began to see as I brought my personal practice, and I was a closet meditator for years at General Mills. But when I began to see was that this practice was very intertwined with another love that I had, which was the development of leadership excellence and mentoring young people and middle managers and developing. And so what I began to see was that, in fact, they're intertwined. And so combining mindfulness practice with fundamentals of leadership excellence, and I use 4, focus, clarity, creativity, and compassion, that they could be used, this training of the mind could be used to allow leaders to be more of who they are. So one of the real strong losses, and maybe it's part of what Dan was saying, this insidious loss of technology, is that too often people in leadership roles, and I define leader as anyone with influence, which means everyone in this room is a leader, for better or worse. We are all leaders. The question is, how can we be a little bit more for better than for worse? So if we think of it as an influence, there were too many leaders who simply consistently felt, time and time again, that something was missing, that they couldn't bring their whole selves to it. And what I began to see is that this meditation practice and contemplative leadership could help fill that void.
All right, quick nuts and bolts question just before we move on. You used the word first up here, meditation. I think a lot of people, when they first come to mindfulness, it sounds very appealing. And then they might hear someone say, okay, now sit in silence for an hour, and they walk out the door.
All right.
Do you need to meditate to be mindful, Sharon?
Well, you don't need to meditate for an hour in silence to be mindful. It's an interesting question. I think, hypothetically, one does not, of course, need to meditate in order to be mindful. But I think realistically, which is where it counts, which is in life, right? We need some kind of immersion training, repetitive training, practical experience, so that we're breathing life into it. We're not just thinking about it. And I think sometimes about a woman I knew in India. She wasn't one of my own teachers, but she was a teacher. And she had a very difficult family situation where she was in an arranged marriage and she wasn't able, her in-laws were not very sympathetic to her wanting to go on retreat or practice, and yet she had grown into a lot of wisdom and had become a teacher. And so people said to her, how did you do that? You didn't get to go on retreat or sit for an hour a day or whatever. And she said, I was very mindful stirring the rice. And I really deeply knew the difference between her and me was that she really was, and that I would just think about it and say, you can be mindful stirring the rice. You don't have to meditate. So maybe I'll just personalize it and say, I have to meditate. Right. I have to have, really, honestly, a daily period, it seems to me, to kind of drop into that place of reinforcing those skills.
Yeah. Well, stirring the rice really speaks to the range of what work is, doesn't it? And as you described, Janice, I mean, a leader isn't just a CEO. A leader can be a leader on the factory floor, a leader in middle management, or a leader in the boardroom. Mm-hmm. So nonetheless, when you think about teaching mindfulness to leaders anywhere on that spectrum, how do you cultivate it? And is it often through meditation? And how does that go over? I mean, when I came out, I observed the Mindful Leadership Program at General Mills. There were people in the room, many of whom got it, and some who certainly had some trepidation.
Sure. So there are 3 parts of what has developed as mindful leadership training. And what's important to know is that it was developed with input. So while I was at General Mills, it was this extraordinary laboratory because my colleagues, and these are colleagues at every level in the organization, although we did start at the level of officer and director for a very intentional reason, which is if you want to influence an organization quickly, you start there. And then you give everybody else permission who's interested in it. And so it had 3 parts. And the first part was, yes, there is meditation, and it's important to have meditation in mindful leadership training, but it's not 45 minutes sitting on a cushion. It's 2 10-minute periods, wherever they fit in your day. The second part of it, though, is called Purposeful Pauses. That's what we call it at the Institute, Purposeful Pauses. And they are, can I stir the rice mindfully? But in the work context, it is, can you create a meditation hallway outside your desk? So every time you get up from your desk and walk along that hallway, you make it a 2 or 3 minute for as long as it takes you to walk through that hallway. That's a purposeful pause. And then the third part of it, which is where we really start to shift what organizations can do, individuals within the organization, is with leadership reflection, which comes from the development of leadership work that I was involved in for 25 plus years. And so when you combine those three, meditation, purposeful pause, leadership reflection, that's how you start to transform an organization.
And Dan, in your book Focus, you again look at a whole range of professionals. Everyone, I remember this wonderful example of the guy in, like, was it Saks Fifth Avenue, who really kind of watched shoppers on the floor and had real attention to exactly what they were doing, all the way to school children, who I want to hear about later. But were these professionals able to carve out that space in a successful way?
Well, the guy you're talking about was actually the floor detective at Barney's.
There we go.
And I spotted him because he was so mindful, but he was looking for something. He wasn't mindful in the general sense of what's happening in my mind. He was interested in who on this floor might be about to put something in her purse. That was what he was. So it was targeted mindfulness. And he was waltzing around very gracefully, but each time he'd be looking at a different cluster of shoppers or a different shopper. So I would say that that's an application of mindfulness. I remember Sharon and I studied with this wonderful Indian teacher, Manindraji, and he used to talk about how you could have a walking samadhi. A walking samadhi is doing anything in life, stirring the rice, but doing it with full concentration. Yeah. That's what he was doing.
Yeah. Sharon, there's this spectrum of perhaps mindfulness, the benefits of mindfulness, if I could be so blunt, that Dan described earlier. Everything from perhaps stress reduction, focus is another benefit. When you talk to the subjects in Real Happiness at Work, was there one that they were gravitating towards most? Or do most people kind of enter through the stress reduction door and perhaps then take a next step towards increased focus and concentration, and then maybe another step towards kind of reflection, self-reflection on motivation and intentions? How does that progression work as the practice deepens in the workplace?
I think it could probably work in all different directions. One of the things I felt really lucky about in doing research for the book is that I got to talk to so many kinds of people doing so many kinds of work. And many of them had been meditating for quite some time, but it wasn't something they talked about in general. You know, there were firefighters, there was an undercover policewoman, there were hedge fund managers and CEOs and special ed teachers and hospice nurses. And it was kind of amazing for me to see the similarities. And of course, through the Garrison Institute, there were domestic violence shelter workers and now the international humanitarian aid workers. And I think a lot of it, they may not call it stress reduction, although they may. It's almost like a quest for resilience. People feel overwhelmed very often. One of the greatest predictors of job dissatisfaction I've heard is feeling unappreciated or underappreciated. We don't feel a great sense of autonomy over our work or necessarily creativity. And a great predictor of happiness at work is a sense of meaning. And very often sometimes people of course find that in the job description, but very often they have to infuse what they're doing with a sense of meaning, which might mean compassion, trying to be compassionate, for example, with everyone you meet. And so there was a yearning, and you could say stress reduction, but I think it actually went a lot deeper than that.
Janice, the executives you teach now at the Institute for Mindful Leadership, what is the primary motivation for them coming to you? What are they looking for?
Yeah. Well, what they're looking for is actually the motivation for the title of my book. So when I began teaching, there were very successful people, and not just at that top level, but very quickly. In fact, the week after the very first mindful leadership retreat was held for these officers and directors. 1 week later came the request that said, I want everyone in my division to be trained, so what else have you got that could get us there? So leaders, good leaders, do what they do. They lead. And when they're touched by something, they want everybody around them to be touched by it. But the answer to the question, what are they looking for? So these are successful people, success in the way you would kind of conventionally define it, in that they had been well-educated, they'd moved up the ladders, they were being recognized for doing something well. And yet, time and time again, when we began to work on mindful leadership together at all levels, people would have this nagging sense that something more could have been done, that there was another part of them that didn't get to come to the surface as much as they wanted it to, because they had so much on the plate. The world was shrinking so fast, and internet seconds is how things change in the business world. So there was always this feeling, and I began to become really curious about that because I felt that myself often. And I began to become curious about it not only for me, but I started to ask people, what would it take? What's the one thing that would make a difference? What else is it that you want or need so that you can bring your whole self, your best self, to decisions and to moments and to connections? And time again, the answer was, I just need some space. And so it's in that space. Can we cultivate that space? Can we begin to take those purposeful pauses that put us in that space where we get to touch our principles, our ethics, who we are, our compassion, and our ability to connect? And that's the draw. And when people were touched by that, the virtual spread started, because there was something new, using an innate capacity in a different way that let them be more of who they are.
And as someone who spends a lot of time around corporate America as a business reporter, I can tell you that's unique to find in corporations, to be sure.
Yeah.
I'm noticing those, it just kind of came to mind, there's almost a contradiction. You talk about this spaciousness, and space is a word you constantly use, and of course I think many people who practice find that the world and time and relations really do breathe much easier. And yet, Dan, the title of your book is Focus, which is much more narrow and very concentrated. Can you help us kind of sort out that seeming dichotomy? How does focus engender spaciousness?
Sure. You could take focus to imply a kind of concentrated beam of attention, but I actually use the term in a broader sense, which is to respect the fact that there are many ways to deploy attention. One of them is in this spaciousness that Janice is talking about, and the mindfulness, but it's not the only one. You can be very... In meditative traditions, there are generally two attentional strategies. One is concentration. In concentration, my first meditation was TM. It's a concentrative technique. You generate a sound, a mantra, and when your mind wanders, you bring it back. In mindfulness, you do something else. You create a platform within awareness, and you just see what arises. You don't follow after it, but you let it come and you let it go. Is that right? just checking.
Sure.
Beginner's mind.
There are other kinds of ways to use attention. One is, when we talk about focus and the advantages of concentration, say in the workplace, and there are definite advantages, it ignores the fact that to be creative, you need a different kind of spaciousness, to let your mind wander freely. And those two things are antithetical. Although, actually, I have some of my most creative thoughts while I'm meditating, but I think I'm cheating when I do. I remember when Indrajit told me, I said, when I first started meditating with him, I said, sometimes I get really good ideas. What should I do with them? He said, write them down and then go back.
So
I've thanked him ever since. Yeah. So in other words, there are many ways to focus, each of which is completely valid and has its uses. We need to respect that. But I think the need for mindfulness, and one of the payoffs for a busy executive or busy anyone today, is that it does give us this spaciousness, this ability to let it go, because so often we're trapped by our mind in this accelerated stream of consciousness that just keeps coming and coming and coming. And it's such a relief not to chase after it.
And what is happening in our brains when all this is happening? I mean, both when we're focused and when we're more spacious, there's this tremendous body of what I love. I love the term contemplative neuroscience. It's a whole new academic field that's emerged in recent years.
And that was one of the reasons I decided to write Focus, which is really in part about the science of attention. There's a new understanding with the last 2 or 3 years of how attention works in the brain, because cognitive scientists are imaging the brain while we're doing these things. So we can see, what circuits activated during mindfulness, during mind wandering, during full concentration, and they're different circuits. So the circuit that wanders inhibits the circuit that concentrates, and vice versa. Well, that figures. And if anybody here has meditated, and I assume it's about everybody, is that right? You may have noticed that your mind wanders from time to time. It does constantly. And the basic repetition in the mental gym, if you will, and this is a mental exercise, is you put your mind in one stance or one place, it wanders off. The mind wanders 50% of the time. There's this wonderful study from Harvard where they gave people iPhones that had an app that beeped them at random times a day. And they asked them just 2 questions. What are you doing and what are you thinking about? 50% of the time, on average, people were mind wandering. Much worse when they're commuting, when they're looking at a digital screen, and when they're working, speaking of mindfulness at work. So the best, of course...
Do you remember the title of that study? A wandering mind is an unhappy mind.
Unhappy mind, because people also said that they're unhappy. However, the most concentrated was when people were making love. And I wonder who would answer an app. I'm not sure I trust that data, actually. Anyway, so the mind wanders, and we're concentrating on one thing, or we're trying to be mindful and not chase after where it wanders. And we notice it wander. That's the moment of mindfulness, noticing the wandering. And then we bring it back. We let go of that thing, or we go back to the point of concentration. That's what strengthens the mind. That's like in the gym when you do a rep with weights. And the circuitry that it strengthens is the circuitry for mindfulness and for concentration, for putting your mind where you want it, which is a really important skill.
Sharon.
I just want to put in a word for compassion, because I think that moment when we realize our attention has wandered is also the moment of compassion as we come back without blaming ourselves or declaring ourselves a failure or going off on this whole train of judging ourselves. And so that's part of compassion training right there.
I was going to ask, because mindfulness today so often is equated with stress reduction, focus perhaps. But how do we make that next leap to compassion? Does mindfulness spontaneously develop compassion? Or does it naturally arise out of the practice? Or is it something that needs to be cultivated in a more deliberate way?
I would say both. If I can get away with that.
You can get away with it.
Okay. I think compassion arises out of mindfulness in part because we are actually exercising compassion in those moments of coming back. It actually is a self-compassion training. I think it arises out of mindfulness because of insight. I mean, originally, or classically, the mindfulness not just serves to heal our lives and have us have a better cup of tea because we're actually paying attention to it, and which is also wonderful. But it primarily serves as the platform for insight. When we pay attention in a certain way, we begin to understand who we are and what life is about, and connection, and aloneness, and happiness, and strength, and everything. And it's out of that insight that compassion arises, because we just see that we're not as cut off and alone as we might feel. We live in an interconnected universe. We're part of this great network or fabric of life. And so the compassion that comes from the insight is not forced. It's not like you say, well, I've got to make myself be kind, but it's like the heart's response to seeing things in a certain way. And I'll put in a good word for actual compassion training or loving kindness training, because I think it works differently, but is an extremely powerful tool. And I think it works in a way that we can recognize sometimes we have certain ways of paying attention, certain habits or ruts, and we intentionally experiment with seeing if we can pay attention in a different way. So, for example, in thinking about ourselves, maybe at the end of the workday, maybe we pretty well only remember the things we said wrong and we didn't do quite right, and all the mistakes that we made, let's just say. And so the training in part is stretching. It's like saying, okay, all that may be true, but can I wish myself well? Can I remember the good that I did or the potential I have? So it's moving our attention in a deliberate way that kind of opens up awareness.
Wonderful. Janice, are you finding that when you work with executives? Does the compassion spontaneously arise?
Well, I think we approach it a little differently in the work that we do. So compassion is, the way we work with it is about understanding, and understanding self, others, and the big picture, so the community, however you define that. And so the understanding, the self-compassion is for most of the people I have worked with, most of the employees I have worked with, the most difficult piece of that. And what often happens, and here's just a little example, a story. I was on retreat, teaching a retreat, and there was and I tell this story with his permission, he was the president of a global aerospace company. And we were about 3 days into retreat, and during the Mindful Leadership Retreat, it's called Cultivating Leadership Presence. And we drop into an extended period of silence. And this particular gentleman was great. He'd come to the meditation building, and he'd shut off his BlackBerry very dutifully. And I'd noticed him, the step outside the door, whoosh, here comes the BlackBerry. But he was very good about, during the sessions, he'd put it away. But when we dropped into silence, I had said, you really need to put everything away, and we, keep it away. And so later that next day, when we dissolved the silence, he shared his story. He said, when Janice dropped us into silence the night before, she made some remark just before we all settled into our meditation about how the stars were so beautiful. And we happened to be in Wisconsin, and we were in a very remote area, and the stars had just been spectacular. They were just so bright that night. And so just as everyone was kind of mulling around, settling in, I just made this little comment to a few people who were near me. Did you happen to see the stars? And we started. He said, so here I am, and I have always been reaching for my BlackBerry the second I step outside the door. But that night, when I was going there, I zipped it up in my suitcase so I wouldn't be tempted, and I left it in my room in my suitcase. And when I went outside, we were in silence, I went outside the meditation room, walking to my room at the retreat center we were at, and sure enough, I reached in my pocket, like robot arm, and there was nothing there. So I then thought, Janice said something about the stars. And I looked up at the stars, and I stopped, and I realized I hadn't seen the stars for 20 years. Wow. And I lay down in the grass, and I can't tell you how long I stayed there. But at some point, I went back to my room, and when the alarm went off to wake me up for the early morning meditation session, the first thought in my mind was, how much have I missed for the last 20 years doing this? And so the connection to self in compassion is the most difficult and most profound piece of it. It's much easier for people in leadership roles to have compassion for others and to have even compassion for the larger community, although that's second hardest. And so what we hope to cultivate, and what actually does become cultivated, is the deeper connection to ourselves starts to generate my ability to be compassionate more and connected more to others, and to become more connected to the community, which is the money deal, which is what we want, the win-win-win, good for the organization, the employees, and the community.
So when an organization starts to have mindful leaders at the helm, and this is really for everyone, because you've all spoken with professionals through retreats, through research, through teaching, how do they make that next step from taking these very personal practices into the workplace and trying to affect change? Because it's wonderful when it can make a change in the individual, and yet we have so much work to do out there in the world.
Yes. Of course, there's much more to do, and that's why I love doing this work. But the answer to that is not that we have, let me back up. Organizations don't exist, right? They're a piece of paper in Delaware. The people who make choices within organizations, they're people invested in by shareholders or philanthropists. And this is for profit, nonprofit. The people are the shareholders. The people are the boards. So it's people. So we like to do these things, but big, bad organization. Well, no, these are individuals. And when they're on autopilot, and when they're not bringing their whole best selves to the party, that's when we have more likelihood that those win-win-win choices are not made, and that they make the choices that they really don't want to make or would prefer not to make. And what I've been seeing time and time again is if you show people how to have the spaciousness to be their whole selves, there is a much greater likelihood that in that gray moment, in that moment of chaos, in that moment of pressure, that they will be able to touch again. And that's why I said the reflection is a critical part of mindful leadership training. And we just did these reflections, Sharon and I, this past weekend. But one of them is, what are your principles? I have been teaching that now for 8 years to groups of people. And with one exception, I have never had anyone say that throughout their careers they have ever been asked when they're hired, what are your principles of leadership? And so that has been an integral part of what we do. And it allows people to touch again why they were called to serve as a leader, why they are called to do whatever work that they're doing. And when we uncover it and keep touching it, that's when we have the chance to touch it again. It's very much like meditation. Yes, you need meditation, so when you take the purposeful pause, you're more likely to be able to feel that breath or feel your feet on the floor. Same thing. If I discover my principles, I'm more likely to touch them again in that chaotic moment.
Dan, you were going to jump in. How have you seen the transition from focus to compassion and ethics play out in the workplace?
Well, I'm really pleased to hear how you integrate this look at your principles and ethics along with mindfulness, but they're not the same. Mindfulness does not necessarily imply ethics. And the famous example is, the samurai, not the samurai, the kamikaze pilots during World War II who were doing Zen meditation, but also killing people, but more precisely because they could focus better. So, there's an ethical dimension, and this practice historically has always been taught with ethics first, with the principles of non-harming and so on. And I think that we're finding a way to weave that in. But I can think of leaders who I admire. I talk in the book Focus, I talk about 3 kinds of focus: inner focus and other focus, as you said, and then an outer focus, which is understanding the complexities of the systems we operate in and the complexities of the shareholders for an organization. And one of my heroes is a guy who's CEO of Unilever, Paul Polman, who has as a target for that company sourcing their raw materials from 500,000 smallholder farmers in the third world. Small farms and helping small farms is the, World Bank says, the best way to improve the health and education and economy of impoverished country. So he has a sense of shareholders that goes beyond stockholders and that sees the planet as part of it. And I admire that. I don't know that he does mindfulness meditation. Maybe he does. I should ask him if I ever meet him. But he's someone I admire. And so I think that, I don't think we should conflate mindfulness with ethics, but I think that as you're doing it, it interweaves beautifully.
It does.
Sharon, do you also concur that kind of mindfulness at best can engender an ethical framework for looking at business, or does it mostly stay in a much more personal context? When you were out reporting for your book, did you see people really taking that personal practice and saying, all right, I've made some changes internally, I'm still doing the work, I'm going to start doing it in the office, on the factory floor, in the boardroom now?
I think one of the most touching examples probably was with the domestic violence shelter workers, because as we started the program with frontline workers, and then directors and supervisors of shelters themselves asked if they could have a program, and so we went there. And as it evolved, they themselves came up with this phrase, a culture of wellness, which they wanted to engender in the shelters. And clearly, sometimes the domain of the sphere of one's influence for a culture of wellness is one's own mind and body, or one's desk. And sometimes it's broader than that. And they investigated a lot of means to try to bring that forth. And when what is obviously a very kind of brutalizing, extremely stressful environment. So yes, and I do think there's a part of mindfulness. It's not only that mindfulness teaching has normally been embedded in a ground of ethical consideration and reflection, but there's a part of mindfulness that isn't just paying attention, but it has to do with discernment, or clear comprehension is the classical phrase, so that there's understanding woven in, and there's a way of looking at things like, I'm experiencing this emotion, whatever it is. If that were to motivate me to action, what's the likely consequence? Because actions are consequential. Is there joy or is there sorrow likely at the end of this? And I think of that pretty recent study out of Northeastern. You'll have to help me with the specificity, maybe where, maybe you can, where I think people were given like 8 weeks or something of meditation training, and then at the end of that period, there was a kind of, they were told to come back into the lab for some further evaluation, but the actual evaluation was happening in the waiting room for the lab, because there were only a certain number of chairs that were set out, and an actor came in looking like they were in terrible pain on crutches, and so the question was, who gets up to offer the chair? And they found some vast amount more meditators than non-meditators were getting up to offer the chair, and so the conclusion was that mindfulness really does lead to compassion.
We're here in the middle of New York City, and Dan used to work at the Times. He knows it's a very competitive environment at times. How do we bring these practices to bear in the workplace without losing our edge, so to speak, without just rolling over, becoming softies and pushovers? And it's a serious question, because just because we might become more mindful and more compassionate doesn't mean all our colleagues are going to do so around us at the same time.
David, I have a story for you.
Please.
I once worked at a major publication. I won't name it.
He's only worked at one.
I worked for a couple. I got a new editor who was not a nice guy. And he wanted to bring in his own people. And he wasn't interested in the people kind of left over from the previous regime. And he took me aside and he said, I think I may have to fire you. And this made me meditate avidly every morning, because the anxiety that I had to handle was going to get in the way of my doing my job well. Yeah. In order to keep my job, I had to do it well. So there's a situation in which, the toxicity, in order to survive the toxicity of the environment, it made me a really ardent practitioner.
Janice, how have you seen that play out? You work with a lot of very high-powered executives who work in very high-pressure situations. How are they able to kind of stay in touch with whatever mindfulness might be cultivating without just losing their edge?
I think that's a common concern, although as soon as you start to speak with people about what their experience of the workplace is, what their experience of leadership is, and we start to share with each other a typical situation, like we sit around a conference room table. We have days packed with meetings, meeting after meeting after meeting, the gray days, meeting, calls. And then we start to actually do some reflection again around calendars. And people say, well, all right, we sit around the table, we're having important meetings about a strategy that we have to figure out. And yet the meeting is 3/4 to almost 100% a waste of time, because people aren't able to pay attention for the whole meeting, or because when we're talking, our mind is so busy planning what we're going to say, and the tension is so high that I'm looking for that opening in the conversation that I'm not listening at all to what's happening. And so when we start to actually make it practical, this is what our experience in the workplace is. This is what it's like to lead. And oh, by the way, competition is going up. It's a global marketplace now. Technology changes everything. And we start to put out, when we talk about this training, we start to put it out there. We can't keep doing what we've been doing. It's bad for the environment, it's bad for culture, it's bad for business. And so it's not about getting soft and making decisions that are sympathetic. I mean, when we teach compassion, we're not teaching. We teach explicitly that it's about understanding and making choices that are win-win-wins. It's not about empathy and sympathy and all of the rest of that. So you can make choices that are good for the organization and for the environment. You can make those kinds of choices, which is our best self as leaders.
Not always, though. I mean,
not always. No,
not always. So when mindful leaders, when all of us at work who might be practicing are confronted with a really tough choice, because there are situations where this is either hurt the bottom line or do the right thing. How can our practice inform making a wise decision? Sharon?
Well, to go back for a moment, I think that it's clearly because of language, and it's somewhat unfortunate that one has an association with the word mindfulness with passivity or complacency or kind of gooiness. And I understand it, because we hear things like mindfulness means you're not going to judge your experience. Mindfulness means you're going to accept things the way that they are. And it does sound really passive and doormat-like. And it's quite difficult to understand, I think, the vitality and the dynamic energy of that state. And people have said to me things like, when I've led guided meditations and started with, okay, let's sit and listen to sound, once somebody raised his hand right away and he said, well, if I hear the sound of the smoke alarm going off, should I sit here mindfully, knowing that the smoke alarm is going off, or should I get up? And I said, I'd get up, But we worry about things like that because the words are very misleading. So, I don't know what one does in that situation, except that you have to have a very different understanding of happiness and long-term perspective, not just short-term gain, in order to make some difficult choices. And the pressure is on, and we're a highly impatient, pressured society anyway, and they're very difficult moral choices and complex decisions that we're engaged in. But I think we do come to a very different sense, and it won't always be easy, and it may not even always be possible, but of recognizing, for one thing, there are consequences to our actions, and that we carry the residue, and that we can live in a different way. Yeah.
As part of the research for my book, I spoke with an attorney who represents the disabled, the disadvantaged, and he said he lost 95 out of 100 cases. And he still got up every day and went to work because he believed in serving these people. I said, how do you do that? How do you keep going back when you have a 5% success rate? He said, I have a very big sense of time. And that's that spaciousness that mindfulness can engender.
Yeah.
We're going to get to questions soon, but I do want to talk for a few moments about how popular this is all getting. I'm sure many people in this room saw the Time magazine cover. Wisdom 2.0 just took place in San Francisco. It was bigger than ever. companies all over the place, all around the country really doing it. Google rolling out its Search Inside Yourself program at companies around the country now. And a huge backlash really coming from not only the traditional Buddhist community, which says that something essential is being lost in the secularization of mindfulness, but also from cynics who say this is just a whitewashing of essentially kind of manipulative corporate practices. So how do we make sense of this? Are there two mindfulnesses right there? Is there kind of a superficial secular mindfulness and an authentic mindfulness? I hope that's not the case, because it would be very confusing to a lot of people, though. But how do we navigate this? Is there a spectrum? Is it one or the other? Janice, what are you seeing? I mean, you are, in a way, are at the very heart of this, taking mindfulness in a very secular context, teaching it in these very corporate settings. So how do you retain the integrity, and what do you make of this brewing backlash?
I think some of the brewing backlash makes some assumptions about what's being taught. And so I think if you cherry pick and all you do is teach focus, for example, and not anything else, then that may be a cherry picking. But the work that I can only speak to the work that we do at the Institute. And the work that we do, as I said, is about focus, clarity, creativity, and compassion. So from the beginning, we are interested in people being their whole selves. And the practices that we use are contemplative practices. They are drawn from mindfulness, but they're also drawn from other contemplative practices. So what we're teaching is really helping people touch again and stop long enough to touch again, discover again how to bring more of themselves, more of their mind's capacity to their decision making. And so sometimes some of the assumptions about what's being taught may be true for some of what's being taught, but are not true for what I think we're teaching, which I do think is about developing stronger ethics and that win-win-win. And can we be perfect? No. And our organization's perfect? No. But individuals aren't perfect either. And what we need to do is meet us where we are and keep moving forward. I guess I'm going to add one more thing if I could, which is one thing to not lose sight of, at least as I look at it, is I have great optimism that most of the people in organizations are people with bright minds and warm hearts. And they're overwhelmed because they're asked to do more with less, and things are moving so quickly, and the technology is fracturing whatever little attention they had to begin with, all of us had to begin with. But at the end of the day, if we can help and cultivate those focus, clarity, creativity, and compassion for each person in the organization, the ripple effect has no limit. And so that's how I think we actually begin to move the dial on some of these things.
Dan, when we spoke, you actually did talk about perhaps two mindfulnesses developing. Is that something you feel like is going to become
let me speak to
predominant? Please.
The critique that you alluded to from the more traditional meditation folks. And the fact is that what you do in a general setting like a business is not what you do in a Buddhist monastery. Mm-hmm. It's not the classical mindfulness. And I don't think it's appropriate for it to be. I think it should be modified in the ways you're doing it. I remember being at a meeting with the Dalai Lama and some scientists, and he looked at one of them, Richie Davidson, who was a founder of contemplative neuroscience. And this is what launched contemplative neuroscience. He said to him, this was a symposium on destructive emotions. He said, you know, Richie, Buddhism has a lot of methods for managing destructive emotions, and we've tried them out for a couple thousand years, and they work pretty well. And I don't think they should be just for Buddhists. I think you should take them out of Buddhism, out of that context, take them into the lab, test them rigorously, and if you find that they're of benefit to people, spread them as widely as you can. And I think that's a lot of the motivation behind the general mindfulness movement, is that it's a movement of compassion but it's not a movement to convert people to any particular religion.
Then why the backlash? Why this vociferous response from, and it's not just coming from kind of hardcore fringe Buddhist community. It's becoming much broader, and it's getting wrapped up in discussions of Silicon Valley even, because so much of the popularization of mindfulness is coming out of the Wisdom 2.0 movement and out of Silicon Valley companies. It is getting wrapped up now in a critique of this kind of techno-utopianism being propagated by the 0.1% in San Francisco.
So people are seeing that mindfulness is being used in the service of a corporate goal that they don't necessarily agree with. I think that's a valid critique. I don't think that I would defend that. I would say that if you take mindfulness and dissociate it from principle and from compassion, you've lost something.
Agree.
You may be gaining in the short term, but I think you're losing in the long term.
Sharon, you founded IMS. You must have a perspective here.
Yes, I mean the whole discussion is fantastic in every sense of the word, because as you know, and you certainly know, when I came back from India in 1974 as a teacher, first of all, there were probably 5 people who knew the word mindfulness in the country, and if I said at a party or something, some social situation that I taught meditation, people would often go, "Ooh, that's weird. Like, what's that?" And it's totally different now, and so the whole thing is kind of fantastic, in so many ways. I would say the secularization doesn't disturb me in any way. I mean, the retreat that Dan brought me to, the first night, the teacher said, the Buddha did not teach Buddhism, he taught a way of life. And so that was the foundation of my understanding forever. And so I don't feel disturbed, or upset in any way that there's some kind of relanguaging. I think that's totally appropriate. And even the Buddha said, when he was sending out his disciples to teach, speak in the local idiom. Right, that was actually an instruction. And so what is our local idiom? It's science and psychology and so on. I do think that the motivation is largely compassion in that kind of spread. And I don't know how the experiment can be made of whether mindfulness will lead to a cultural shift in an organization or in a society without making the experiment, right? So we're not at a place, I think, where we can draw a conclusion that this is wrong. This hasn't worked.
Depends what you mean by ego. Freud talked about the ego not in the sense of the little self that just cares about itself and no one else. He talked about it as the part of the mind that's functional. That's the part of the mind you use as the platform for mindfulness. It's not about me, it's about looking at and understanding the discernment that you talk about. And so if you practice mindfulness from the little sense of ego, then I think there are problems. But if you use it in the purely functional sense, then you're right on.
I think you've pinpointed what can become the most difficult place, because when you are asked to make a choice that, well, this can further my career if I do this, but if I go in this direction, it would be more collaborative and I might bring more people along, but then that could jeopardize my ability to advance my career. So I think that is probably the most difficult intersection, and the place where it depends on your circumstance. I don't think the answer is always hurt yourself or hurt your career advancement, and I don't think it's always that. I think it's about finding what makes sense and what's the balance and what's the cost benefit of each of them, and not being tunnel vision. I'm only going to do what's right for me in my career advancement. So my hope in these practices and in this training is that people have a more expansive view about it and be more creative and more compassionate in their choices. But it's not about always depriving yourself either. So it is, I think you've pinpointed one of the most difficult places, yeah.
I think it can go both ways. I think when we talked about mindfulness engendering a broader sense of ethics, that could clearly lead mindfulness to be an inhibitor to making certain choices. I mean, if there's a decision in a boardroom where we could cut costs on environmental policy, but it might boost the bottom line, the mindful leader might say, well, the mindful choice is to do the ethical thing, but we might have to hurt the bottom line if we do that. So I think that's one of the cases we were discussing. As for can mindfulness be a good business choice, I think the answer is absolutely yes. And there are many examples that I'm hoping to document that show just that. I'll mention just one. Aetna, the health insurer up in Hartford, Connecticut, very close. The very mindful leader, Mark Bertolini, did wonderful work subsequent to a very severe accident he had personally. Turned to vinyasa yoga, then started practicing mindfulness and meditation, thought, if it works for me, maybe it'll work for others. Rolled out across the country first a pilot study with a few hundred, then a few thousand employees, both in Hartford and in Walnut Creek, California, and then rolled it out to his entire company. Made mindfulness and yoga practices available to all of the company. Thousands of people in this 30,000-person organization began practicing. And in the first full year that they rolled out these practices, healthcare costs internally at Aetna fell 7%. That's $90 million. How much of that you can really attribute to exactly those programs? I'm not going to sit here and count pennies, but it seems to have made a difference. Aetna has then gone on to offer both mindfulness and yoga programs to its clients. So that's part of their suite of offerings now. So I think it can definitely go both ways.
I think of wisdom as an emergent property, not necessarily as a technique or a tool, but it's the classical emergent property out of seeing clearly. Because what are we looking at? We're looking at the nature of reality, of who we are and the fact that we're connected and everything's changing all of the time. And so the meditative tools are ones that clear away the filters, the bias, the fears, and so on, so that we can connect more clearly, and then wisdom arises. So rather than, I think one clear tendency in the country is to commodify everything. So rather than thinking of wisdom as a thing that we're going to acquire, I think of the meditative process as creating the conditions for wisdom to arise. And if wisdom is not arising, then I would question the tools.
I'll take that.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I particularly liked your question because I use this a lot as well. Not what do you want to do as an adult, but who do you want to be as an adult. When I was first at General Mills, I was new there. And unfortunately, one of the first things that happened, it rarely happened at General Mills, but one of the first things that happened was a potential recall situation. And those are very, very tough. So I worked with a team, and then my job was to go to the CEO with a recommendation. I'd never, other than the interviewing process, hadn't yet spent any time with him. So here I go walking in with this bad news. And I had a bunch of options. We can do this. We can do this, here's how we would, what we're obligated to do, and here's another way that would be beyond what we're obligated to do and more. And he asked me only one question. So I went through my whole thing. I'm a young, not really that young then, but new to that organization. Yeah, I know, I'm not young. Okay.
You're young, actually.
We got to the end. So I went through my whole thing. I was new. I wanted to cover all my bases, showing us. He asked me only one question at the end. What's the right thing to do? It set for me a tone for the rest of my career there that's my marching orders. What's the right thing to do? And I told him, this is what I think is the right thing to do, and that's what we did. And so that's the kind of tone that a leader can set, and the ripple effect is enormous. What's the right thing to do? Yeah. Thank you.
I don't think that awareness or mindfulness necessarily leads to compassion. I think it may lead to, remember, motivation matters. Motivation matters. And this is why, I think, why the classical meditation systems all teach compassion and all teach ethics from the get-go. That becomes the context in which you do the practice. Because what you're doing from a cognitive science point of view is sharpening certain mental faculties. You're not necessarily ending up at a certain ethical premise. I think that the two need to be brought together.
Calling to mind our teacher, Munindra, one of our teachers. A distinction that he would make certainly is between practices that are pretty well about concentration and those that are using mindfulness as the engine for the uncovering of wisdom. Clearly it's possible just to concentrate, which in the Buddhist psychology is considered ethically neutral. It's just placing your attention somewhere more strongly and developing a stability of attention, but it all, the moral valence depends on what accompanies it. Greed, love, it could be anything, whereas mindfulness is said to be the engine for wisdom. It's paying attention, not just steadying your focus, but it's paying attention, being able to step back and take a look. It's having some perspective. It's seeing into the nature of things so that you're not just stabilizing, but you're refining and uncluttering and really opening your attention so that you can see things as they are. Otherwise, it's not actually considered mindfulness.
There's another added dimension. That is, research does show that mindfulness enhances empathy.
Mm-hmm.
And empathy, resonating with other people, can go either way.
Mm-hmm.
You can, cognitive empathy, understanding how people think, can give you competitive edge as a lawyer. Emotional resonance and empathic concern, which are two other varieties of empathy, lead to compassion. I could speak to that because my wife is a student of mindful arts. She studied Japanese tea ceremony, for example, which is a mindful art. Mindfulness is part of it. In the tea ceremony, you pay full attention to what's going on now. You don't talk about other things. You stay fully in the moment. I recommend her book, Emotional Alchemy, which talks about that, and Mind Whispering. It talks about exactly that connection.
I don't use art, but we do use writing. So we don't do kind of visual arts, but writing is a part of what we use.
Sharon, have you worked with artists and see them use their craft as a way to bring about mindfulness and compassion?
I do, and I actually thought of it the other way around. You asked an earlier question that I thought was going to be different, and because a common question is, doesn't creativity have to come from a place of pain? And if I get quite balanced, aren't I going to lose my edge and cease to be questing or questioning? And I think that's the same misunderstanding about mindfulness, that it will make our life smaller and somehow much more conventional, rather than being able to question everything, which is what I think it actually does.
And instead, as we heard time and time again, it really engenders not a closed worldview, but a much more spacious one. So thank you very much to our panelists.
Thank you.